Good afternoon, everyone. Happy first day of summer. Welcome to Building on Strength Year 3 Summit. I'm Andy Gilbert, Chair of the Economic Development Planning ELT for the Lancaster City Alliance. Our ELT has served as the steering committee for the Building on Strength plan for the past 5 years, which goes back to selecting the consultant team and managing the development of the plan. The plan was rightly called Building on Strength because of the strong foundation that had already been built, in part, by the 1998 LDR plan and the support of city revitalization driven by many of the leaders in this room. Our charter as the Economic Development and Planning ELT is to offer up our professional expertise to advance the Building on Strength plan and help it to be a dynamic tool. You'll hear from Marshall in a bit about the evolving nature of the plan over the last 3 years of implementation. But first, a little context about today's special event and who's gathered here. At an ELT meeting a few months ago, it was suggested that because of the success of the plan and many evolving recommendations, we should invite our consultants back to Lancaster to have a deliberate and meaningful dialogue about challenges we've faced and progress we've made. We appreciate the participation today by Tom from Mahan Rykiel, Trip from Arnett Muldrow, and John from RGS. We're very fortunate to also have in the room with us Building on Strength core community implementation partners, as well as 2 other Lancaster City Alliance ELTs, who have all had an important connection to Building on Strength plan. The Chairpersons Council, comprised of elected officials, volunteer board chairs, and lead staff from select nonprofit organizations, who have high-level strategic discussions 3 times a year on critical economic development-related issues. Many of these individuals have helped to serve as a sounding board during the development of the Building on Strength plan. Also here today is the Advocacy ELT, whose members meet bi-monthly and focus attention on building strong relationships with both city and county public officials. They assert themselves to influence public policy critical to the success of Lancaster, especially relevant and essential to the advancement of the Building on Strength's ambitious goals. With that, I'd like to introduce Jane McMahon of M&T Bank and Chair of the Lancaster City Alliance Chairpersons Council. Jane?
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for spending your afternoon with us. I'm Jane McMahon, and as Andy indicated, I'm Chair of the Lancaster City Alliance Chairpersons Council. The Chairpersons Council was formed in 2010 on the premise that there was an opportunity for leading economic development-focused organizations to better coordinate and cooperate on their individual initiatives. The Council is intentionally focused on the City of Lancaster, and since the introduction of the Building on Strength plan, it is used predominantly as our playbook for our meetings. Our meetings have a strong focus on specific attributes and recommendations for neighborhoods, plan funding, specific investment sites, and other timely topics which benefit from the insight of our attendees. We have kept the Building on Strength plan at the forefront of our discussions in order to help the plan's priorities and initiatives through our network of leaders.
I forgot my tie and coat. Look at that. There it is. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Jim Warner, and I chair the Advocacy Committee for the Alliance. Fittingly, our normal meeting typically falls on today's date, so we're pleased to have been asked to be part of this conversation, looking at the 3-year progress here. A priority for the Advocacy ELT is building strong and intentional relationships with our elected officials through regular meetings that focus on timely and meaningful conversation around the city's future. And much like Jane said, advancing and advocating Building on Strength's primary strategies are a leading deliverable for our team. Early work for us including advocating at the state level with then Pennsylvania Senator Smucker to obtain the CRIS designation. Broadly promoting third-class city reform in partnership with the city administration. And more recently, encouraging the investment the Alliance is making in the Safety Coalition, tweaking the CRIS legislation, and taking a more holistic view of the city and its regional transportation programs. All with the goal of trying to make Lancaster a world-class city. And I think we're making great progress on it. Thank you. Jeremy.
As Jeremy comes up to the front, right now is sort of the culmination of a great day. We had a tour with the consultants this morning. We had a great lunch with some of the plan funders this afternoon with a great conversation that some of those talks I think will be expanded upon this afternoon. But all in all, this has been a fantastic and not a little long day for everyone. It's hard to believe that this is 5 years into Lancaster City Alliance, and when Lancaster City Alliance began, we were charged with managing the development and the implementation with our many partners in this room of the Building on Strength plan. Now that we're 3 years in, we've taken another look at this plan. So what we're going to start with before we get to some great questions and to talk to our experts is Jeremy's going to give a brief synopsis of where we are now. We'll talk about some of the changes that we're calling a recalibration of the plan, and then we'll move into a more robust discussion. Jeremy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction, Marshall. I'm Jeremy Young, Community and Economic Development Manager here at Lancaster City Alliance. And as Marshall said, I'll take you through how we're progressing here at year 3 into the 15-year plan. First, with a review of the plan's 2030 outcomes. This is a 15-year plan. We began measuring progress July 2015, and when we hit the ground running. Many of you in this room by now should be very familiar with what the outcomes are. So we've got an increase in per capita income to 70% of that of Pennsylvania that we'd like to see by 2030. We'd like to create 300 new hotel rooms by 2030 in the downtown and commercial hubs, 2,500 new residential units, 100,000 square feet of new retail and restaurant space, 300,000 square feet of office and flex space, and in total, $1 billion of investment that's privately led. That's the key. So how are we measuring? It's a bit, but the brown bars we're calling anticipated progress, and anticipated progress in terms of the bricks and sticks or development focused projects or outcomes are projects that are in various phases of the development pipeline, whether they're in the conceptual phase, planning phase, currently under construction, or construction recently completed. And we'll skip past the first outcome on the left, which is not bricks and sticks focused, and move on to the 300 new hotel rooms outcome. To date, we have 110 new hotel rooms under construction, and you're all very well aware of that with the Marriott hotel expansion, and you've probably seen the scaffolding go up on the Hotel Lancaster, currently being renovated to a Holiday Inn. Moving along to 2,500 new residential units is the desired outcome. This is a metric or an outcome that will probably move a little bit more slowly than some of the other outcomes, and some of the other outcomes you see we are exceeding our desired outcome. Housing projects tend to take a little longer. It's a little more difficult to make those numbers work. But however, 3 years in, I think it's still remarkable that we've gotten 230 new housing units within our landlocked city constructed, some of those still under construction currently. But if all of the housing projects that are in the pipeline are completed, we'll have just shy of 900 in just this amount of time, 36 months. You can see where the needle is well above the mark on retail and restaurant space, as well as office and flex space. When we developed the plan 3 years ago, or more than 3 years ago, we thought some of these outcomes were ambitious. And when you see success like this, you start to question maybe those outcomes or goals weren't ambitious enough. Keep in mind, we've had some larger projects like the 101 North Queen project, which during the development of the plan, we weren't quite sure that that investment site would take off so quickly. 40,000 of that retail and restaurant space accounted for in this 148,000 square feet is at 101 North Queen alone. Similarly, 80,000 of the 300,000 square feet goal of office space is at 101 North Queen. We're very fortunate to see all of this investment in 36 months. When you look at the outcome of $1 billion in privately led investment, Factoring in all those projects in various phases of development currently, we're exceeding the halfway mark at over $500 million, $540 million. Nearly $400 million recently completed or currently under construction as we speak. Moving back to the far left, per capita income increase to 70% of Pennsylvania. That's probably going to be the needle that will rise the slowest, and it'll take the most time to watch that one rise. But we've gotten our first data set, and it's showing us that we've seen a very, very slight increase in the per capita income, less than 1%, but still positive, better than a decrease, one might say. We are very cognizant of the fact that despite this very marginal increase in the per capita income for the city, that we do have a slight increase in the poverty rate at the same time, which is hovering just under 30%. In terms of bricks and sticks projects, 40 prime development opportunity sites were identified and prioritized within the downtown core and the plan's commercial hubs. And as of this month, 16 of those 40, or 40%, have recently been developed or are currently under development. Quite remarkable. Here are those 40 sites that were identified during the development of the plan. Many of those in the downtown core and the other commercial hubs, which are the primary corridors leading into and out of the city: South Duke Street, East King Street, Manor Street, South Queen, South Prince, New Holland Avenue, etc. The Bulova site, 101 North Queen. We're seeing some action on the upper floors of some buildings. The Candy Factory, a great example. Conestoga Plaza in the southeast, which is really a wonderful project, and we're really excited to see that one come on where it's really needed. Plum and Walnut Anchor, the Best Engine Works, also called Tobacco Avenue, currently under construction. The planned focus areas, again, the downtown core and the commercial hubs on the map here. And we just wanted to show you where those dollars are being invested to date. In the CBD, where one might say it's most logical that they're going to be invested. Similarly, we're seeing some investment on Harrisburg Avenue and the Northwest Triangle. But we're really starting to see it where it's most needed: South Duke Street, South Prince and South Queen, and West King Street. And we're hoping to see investment increase in some of those corridors where it's really needed in the next few years. With that, quick overview of plan progress. Marshall will explain how we're progressing on the plan's specific recommendations and how we've sort of recalibrated as the plan's evolved.
Thanks, Jeremy. So Jeremy was talking about the plan outcomes. They're easy to track. You know, it's all bricks and sticks. One of the challenges we've been having is, if you look at our plan aspirations, retaining talent and creating jobs, livable wages, equity, these things are a lot more difficult, frankly, to track. And now we're working hard in doing that. And I think the important piece to this is many of these aspirations align with the Poverty Commission report. So that just makes it all more important and we were intentional when this plan was developed, that a primary focus would not be poverty, that the poverty piece should have its own focus with its own plan. So that's why the two plans were done simultaneously, but it's key that these plans work together. So as we look at these aspirations and look at how we can track them, we'll be doing that in cohort with the Poverty Commission. So the plan. 3 years into the plan, in the beginning, this plan was always meant to be somewhat elastic and able to change as needed. And we've had implementation partners, a core group that's here, other implementation partners that equate to about 50 people. Many of the organizations are represented here that have been working together, coming together quarterly to talk about the progress of the plan, where we are, where the challenges are, and are all the recommendations still relevant? So taking a closer look, after 3 years, we have made a few changes. And you can see that we've actually added some recommendations to the plan, and which have changed some of the short-term, medium-term, and long-term. You can see for long-term, we've become more realistic. For some, where we thought 4 of the projects and recommendations could be done in a short period of time. We are now, in a longer period of time. We're now more realistic, realizing that some are going to take more time than others, so that's jumped from 4 to 10. So with that said, of the 33 recommendations we have now, 25 of them are in progress, which is still astounding, for this plan within 3 years. So some of the changes, and we'll be very brief because we do want to hear from the consultants. But strategy 1, which was the traditional economic development, more of the sticks and bricks. The green dots show where things are moving, very well. The yellow dots are they're moving, but maybe not as fast, or could be moving faster. And the red dots are things that we're seeing barriers that are impeding progress. The text that you see in red for each one are sort of changed or new recommendations or sub-recommendations that we created. We won't go through all of these, but we will make all of this available. But I just want everyone to know that this is something that we are always looking at with the steering committee and with all the groups implementing the plan. You can see in building the market, the green here, the facade grant program, that is something that is moving, very well, and that's thanks to our philanthropic community. Between the Steinman Foundation, the Hyde Foundation, we're able to work, with our partners, whether it's SOWE, SACA, LHOP, CAP, to work on facade grant programs that will really do great things for the corridors or the commercial hubs, especially Manor Street, South Prince, and South Queen. The building infrastructure grants is always a little challenging. That is, how do we do upper story development? Dealing with ADA, dealing with code, and it's really difficult it's more difficult to find the money, to find to have developers the tools to actually do the upper story redevelopment. Although we are seeing that happen. Planned funding program. This is something that we decided to sort of break into 2. What we're seeing now, and this is a topic of discussion for many of the groups that are here, is our affordable housing issue. Part of what we have done over the last 10 years is work very hard to build the market for housing with the goal of making projects actually be able to pay for themselves. And to do that, we needed to command higher rents. That's happening. In fact, for many of the projects, especially in downtown, 10 years ago, when average rent was $90 to $1.20, a square foot, now for new projects, they're doubling that. So while we've done a great job of building the market, we're also becoming a victim of our own success. So with that, as new projects are being looked at for the city, having our market rate is increasingly becoming luxury, and in turn, some of the housing that is already here that is somewhat substandard is allowing them to raise their prices as well. So we thought that it's important that as we look at this plan, let's be intentional about looking at affordable housing and mixed income housing, and have strategies that, and again, this works with the Poverty Coalition and some others. But let's make sure that this is something that we tackle intentionally. Funding for strategies 2, 3, and 4 is just how do we raise money to do the rest of the plan. Strategy 2 recommendations. This is dealing with the entrepreneurs. What's great about this is the 2A, which was the Entrepreneurs Forum. This was bringing all the entrepreneurs and the resource providers together so that they all get to know each other with the goal of making it as easy as possible for our entrepreneurs to get the resources that they need. Out of that, in creating the forums, we brought together the resource providers that include SCORE, Assets, and we do this actually in partnership with Assets, Small Business Center, Kutztown, all of these groups that are helping entrepreneurs get off the ground come together. In doing that, we realized that they only really come together to do Cultivate, and they don't really come together for any other reason. And so we embarked on what we're calling the Entrepreneurial Coalition that brings them together on a regular basis, and we're designing what the current ecosystem is for entrepreneurs. And are the resource providers duplicating services? What holes are there that need to be filled? And how do we make it as easy as possible for those entrepreneurs to get to those services? Through that, we were actually able to get a grant from the Lancaster County Foundation to move forward with that. That's in full swing, again, in concert with Assets. But in looking at this recommendation, we are now going to be looking to the coalition to drive this recommendation. So in developing these ecosystems, when we were first looking at, where should a tech hub go? Where should an innovation center go? Where should an art lab go? And now we're taking a step back to see where do these fit into the ecosystem, and then and should we be looking at existing programs like, for instance, the Candy Factory, which now has a tech accelerator in that building in partnership with Ben Franklin. Instead of creating new, let's work with this ecosystem and start to push resources towards things that are already happening. Marketing. We're always going to continue to market the city as a great place to live. In 3B, we're actually are being more intentional now as marketing the city as a great place for developers to create places for people to live. We have such a tight housing market now that we were a little careful in overpromising the amount of residential that we have here. So when you see 3B1, that is being intentional about working with developers, working with current property owners to develop additional housing of all types and all price points. And then we'll always continue to, as well as retain our commercial investment, but attract new commercial investment, and that's in concert with EDC and our other partners. We want to continue to build the city brand, and then working with Loop, and then with Discover Lancaster, continue marketing the city as a great place to live, work, and play. Strategy 4, this is really quality of life. Working with community organizations on economic development in the neighborhoods is still key. Street network and improved accessibility. The efficient transportation, internal and regional, that is looking at transportation more broadly. The plan originally called for a circulator, and while that is part of what we should be looking at, but the real key is how do we make it easy for residents in this city to get from neighborhood to neighborhood, to get to jobs, and how do we get them to effective transportation that will get them out of the city if need be, and then how do we get people coming into the city around. So it's really looking at transportation, in a more broad way than initially for the plan. And then we're also looking at comprehensive parking, not only for downtown, but for the neighborhoods, which could be impeding some of our commercial growth in the neighborhoods. The Lancaster Parking Authority is about to release a study on a comprehensive parking strategy. What is important about this is that they're not only looking at supply and demand for downtown, they're looking at supply and demand for the commercial hubs as part of the plan, and more importantly, they're looking at the future of transportation and parking, in general. Do we still need as many? Will we still need as many cars? Will we still need as many parking garages? And what effect that will have on parking in the future? And finally, our neighborhood healthy food initiative, the Healthy Corner Stores initiative, which was led by LG, they've actually met their goal of 25 stores. So, with that, we were just talking to them, and now as we work on commercial hubs, economic development and commercial hubs, the thought is now let's expand that thought into how do we integrate healthy food into commercial development in general. How do we make sure that the fast food and some other places aren't preying on certain areas? And for instance, in some cities, in some neighborhoods, they actually ban or they have a limit on how many fast food restaurants can go in a certain area. So it's just thinking more broadly in those terms. So with that, 4 o'clock. Those are the changes that we've made, again, in partnership with many of you in this room, the implementation partners and the core implementation partners. We are now going to turn it over to some questions and for our esteemed panel. And first, which is again after we did. This was a tour that we took this morning. So as you can see, we've had quite a day. We visited every site, every street. Got it? No, I'm just kidding. But it was, let's just say, a robust tour. So they had a lot to take in. They had a lot of comments. And first, we're going to I'd love to hear your insights on what you've seen while you were here compared to what you saw 3 years ago when we released the plan. And then we have a few questions that we'd like to pose to the group, and then hopefully there'll be time for our partners here to ask a few questions as well. So I'd like to introduce Tom McGilloway, Principal of Mahan Rykiel, Trent Muldrow of Arnett Muldrow Associates, and our own local John Hershey of RGS Associates. Welcome. So, Tom, why don't I start with you? An initial reaction, and just so you know, we did emphasize that we did not want this to be all about praise. We know how great we're doing in many things, but we know there are some challenges. So if you just start singing our praises the entire time, we're probably going to have to punch you or do something. But be candid.
I'll just hold it. Well, thank you. Yeah, it was really great. I'm down in Baltimore, so I do get up to Lancaster a lot, and have been in the downtown over the past couple of years several times, but this was the first I've gotten out into some of the commercial hubs, and it really is a challenge to not be able to just praise, because it's pretty tremendous, the work that's been done and going on. And I think, especially seeing some of the activity in the commercial hubs and SOE neighborhood and some of the efforts that are going on there, it's a big change from what we saw 3 years ago. And we've, Marshall and Jeremy introduced us to some new investment sites that could be added to the plan. They're off of the corridors, or off of the hubs, commercial hubs, many of them. And we think there's a potential risk of not tying them back to the hubs. And so I think as you continue to look at those investment sites, use some of the great work you're doing with the tree program, the streetscape program, and so there's a many to tie those sites back to the hub to help leverage some more investment into the hub centers. I think one of the other things is, there's, I think, and we've experienced this in other cities, and I don't know if I've seen it in Baltimore, and I don't know if you're going to experience it here, but there's always a risk of really not maximizing the potential for some of these sites, that you might, there might be a temptation that they're developed with one-story buildings, or, and especially in an area with development sites being at such a premium in Lancaster, you really want to maximize the development potential on some of those sites.
Well, guys, remove this.
Don't even try. Just move
I'll
the
just hold.
Just move the whole
You're
thing
going to use
forward.
mine?
There you go. John and I can chime in here. Well, I will heap praise just to begin with. Yeah, I've been doing urban economic development now for 25 years in communities across the country, and it's really astounding to see a community do what I call work the plan. That's a real distinction from what we're accustomed to in a lot of communities, where there's some degree of implementation, but when there comes a situation that arises that may shift priorities or change the outlook, the community stalls out or throws up their arms in frustration and says, well, we can't achieve that for whatever reason. Really working a plan is one where, as Marshall said, you use the elasticity built into the plan to say, this is a guiding document, and circumstances and situations are going to change over the years. And so I can't say enough how impressive it is to see the community work the plan. Tom and John and Marshall already know, I got here a little early yesterday and started texting, wow, oh my gosh, wow. And so the impression is really profound. With that said, I want to dovetail on some of Tom's comments and touch on a few things that I know we'll get into in greater detail as we talk through this. Some of the indices that you're using, I think it's important to reflect on those, since that was one of the things you tasked us with doing in the plan, is indicating those markers. And certainly there's a correlation and an issue with regard to the poverty level and to the per capita income rate that I know may give you heartburn when you see those bar charts across the board with one another. I think you're wise to contemplate migrating that poverty or that per capita income in more association with the poverty report and not necessarily bricks and sticks, because when you look at construction and square footage of space and hotel rooms and then increase of per capita income, we're really talking about apples and oranges, and we're talking about a measure or a yardstick of measurement that's going to be much more over time, and we could get really into the weeds on, you know, whether you're measuring per capita income or median household income or so forth. With regard to the commercial office space, the retail space, the hotel space, I think you're going to be, I think we in the original plan undershot that, and it's very likely that even though the hotel space is not, rooms have not hit that threshold, you're going to far surpass in the 15-year time frame what the plan anticipated. And then with regard to retail and office, you've already exceeded it and will continue to see, I don't see any end in sight. So that's encouraging. What that means is, you know, continuing to be thoughtful though on things like housing, and I know we'll address that in a little greater detail as we move ahead in the questions.
Although I've been fortunate to be in the trenches these past 3 years, designing and getting land development approvals for many of the projects we looked at this morning, there were still things that I wasn't aware of, and I learned a lot as well. Sites that have recently come on the market where redevelopment is likely going to happen in the very near future. I even added a few tourist stops to the Alliance's long list of lineups. For example, we went to Water Street Mission, and I shared with my colleagues the recent debate in our community about our balancing preservation and development that occurred there with those facilities. We spoke of the very grassroots effort of establishing a park on Beaver Street, a very poor neighborhood, with the neighbors have come together to work with CAP and the City of Lancaster to create a park in their neighborhood where there's very little green space. So it's just a great opportunity of looking at projects of all different scales and sizes.
So we talked a lot about the progress that we're seeing. And you may touch on this a little bit, but were there instances where you saw us sort of moving in the wrong direction?
I mean, I don't know if wrong is the right direction, but I think you could, and you're already doing this, refocusing, you're reshifting some efforts. You've taken some of the recommendations that and divided them into, you know, for example, the market, establishing the market district. That was a very broad recommendation, and you've divided it out into some more specific recommendations that are a little easier to measure. Some successes are going to happen sooner than later. So that was it was a good move there. I think it's going to be really important to make some deliberate focus on some of the more challenging recommendations. You know, some of the things have been happening so well and so quickly. Not exactly saying they're low-hanging fruit, but you know, to focus on some of the commercial hubs. It's going to, and the affordable housing and some of the equity in the neighborhoods, that's going to have to be deliberate and really a conscious effort to move in that direction.
And I would concur with Tom. I would not say anything is necessarily in the wrong direction, but there are a couple things that I think that could very easily fall by the wayside if they're not tended to very carefully and very soon. With the recommendations in the plan with regard to transit within the core of the downtown, and looking at some of the changes that are likely to take place with circulators or some of the trolley loop system here. A dense city like this, where you have fixed route transit with fairly long headways, and with the massive changes we're seeing in the way we deal with transit across the country, I would urge everyone to not just let that slide. Getting people from their homes to their jobs and getting, particularly a community that's visitor oriented, getting choice riders to elect to use transit is something that really is going to be something to face you in the coming years, particularly as we migrate away from exclusively using automobiles into looking at what we're already seeing with Uber and Lyft and some of the pending drive out yourself cars. That does not absolve communities of the responsibility of really looking at alternate choices. And so we see communities like Tampa and Delray Beach in Florida. They're working with a company called the Downtowner. They have electric shuttle systems that basically they're, for lack of a more elegant term, they're large golf cart kind of things that covered and air conditioned, and they carry passengers and are ADA accessible, and they pick up where fixed route transit leaves off and shuttles people throughout the core of the communities downtown. That's a private sector partnership with public transit agencies with support of local government. That's just one specific example of looking at that.
Yeah, and I think Marshall talked about the parking study and plan that's going to be done, and I think alluded to the fact that it's not going to just look at traditional parking, and we're finding more and more in the communities we're working at the conversations of future trends in transportation, the role of autonomous vehicles. Some of the experts indicate that it's probably 5 years before they're really available to the consumer, and maybe 20 years before 50% of the fleet is autonomous vehicles. But it's something that you need to start thinking about now in planning for parking. And the other is planning for parking decks that, as transportation trends change, are the parking decks adaptable to other uses? So rather than doing the 9-foot floor to floor, that maybe it's a 13-foot floor to floor, and you're doing something different with the ramping so that you have level floor plates that can be adapted into other uses. And those are some challenges that it's really hard in the transition period that you really need to look at in the future.
It's a minor thing, but just retaining the message to developers who want to do great things here that this is a development-friendly city. I think the land development process has actually grown in time in recent past, from what was typically 4 weeks to now 6 weeks. And just last evening, getting approval for the Fulton Theater expansion, it was a 6-month process for a relatively simple building addition and some streetscape enhancements. So I think there's some room for improvement there, if I had to point at one.
And I'll start on this one. I think the first thing I want to say is this issue is not unique to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We are in what's been dubbed in recent months the 2018 housing crisis, which is very different than the 2008 housing crisis. The 2018 housing crisis, and there's a lot of ink being spilled on this right now, is one of affordability issues in cities across the United States, and a disconnect between living wage and affordability inside of core cities. And so what you're seeing here in Lancaster is happening in communities all across the United States. My hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, our housing costs increased by 53% over the last 10 years. Asheville, North Carolina increased by 58%. Gainesville, Florida by 48%. What it's doing for people who have a workforce job is pushing them further and further out, which is putting further pressure on the transportation networks getting into the communities. I think we have to be very, so with that understanding, recognize that the problem and the issue that you're facing is not unique to Lancaster. It's going to be something that our nation is going to deal with in the coming months and years. And so creative solutions are a little bit at the a little paltry right now, because we're facing something that has traditionally been viewed as a West Coast problem or a Boston problem and a New York problem, and not one that faces medium and small communities and mid-America communities. And so some of the lessons that we take from these big cities aren't necessarily applicable here. With that said, there are a couple things I want to be careful to advise you on. Is just because construction costs and worker wage costs are driving up the cost of housing, that doesn't mean that that's the knob that has to be dialed in order to create affordability. And so if affordability ends up being in the form of a write-down of land costs to reduce developer costs overall, then that allows for the living wage to continue to be paid, and the upward pressure on cost of labor to continue in that particular piece. The other piece is not necessarily maybe even aiding the developer as it would be letting the market sort of do what it will with the developer and aiding the tenant or the purchaser. And that's where we see things like employer-assisted housing programs writing down the cost of housing even though the cost is going up. And so partnering with some of your key businesses here to explore that. I was in Blacksburg, Virginia on Monday and Tuesday of this week, and they're exploring a partnership with Virginia Tech, very similar to what Yale did in New Haven, Connecticut, with a very robust employer-assisted housing program with down payment assistance or rent assistance to get into neighborhoods, not just the upper echelon of the university, but the workforce on the front lines, whether it's people doing service in the food service industry at the university or others to stabilize neighborhoods. So, so that's going to be important. And I'll end on a really key note that I think is thrilling that you all are exploring. One is the funding of the land bank. I think that's critical. And the fact that you've done it and you have partners that have done it is astounding. That's very important. The other piece is working with LHOP on the Community Land Trust. That is probably one of the most amazing tools available to us in the country as far as sustainable, affordable housing programs. And I urge you to reach out to communities that have effective land trust programs and explore them because it's not, and to continue to do that as a partnership and not just a single entity pursuing it, because it's going to take everyone sitting at the table to implement a land trust, which is a pretty technical process, but one that's sustainable and keeps that affordability in place.
Sure. Can you elaborate on the land trust and its relationship to the land bank?
Yes, so the land bank is in the plan. The recommendations were sequential and it was done on purpose. The chief problem with a land trust is it needs to be capitalized. A land bank is basically a set of money to acquire land. Now, the two aren't necessarily always correlated, but capitalizing your land bank is important. That's just setting aside money to acquire property. That's really what land banking is, and that deals with some of the tough issues of land acquisition and site assembly, particularly in a built-out community that's dense. And so it's critical that you have that already in place, and that should be considered a massive victory for you. The land trust is quite different because it's a tool by which you leverage land acquired in order to preserve affordability and housing. And so what happens is the land trust is a tripartite arrangement between a local government, a nonprofit entity, and residents who live within land trust property. The residents live on a 99-year leasehold. It's a valid real estate instrument. It's inheritable. You can bequeath it. You can sell it. You can do anything you can do with a traditional. But with that ground lease held, there are certain restrictions that the land trust can put on it, such as capping the equity someone can pull out of a house, which prevents predatory flipping of houses in neighborhoods and preserves affordability where necessary. Communities that fine-tune this the right way can pull money out of that by saying we're going to cap equity at this point, but we also are going to take some of the equity out and put it back into the land trust itself. There's some really spectacular models. There's some in Vermont that are fairly aged. That's where this thing started. I would encourage you to look more in Sunbelt communities because they're pushing the envelope on the land trust model. I just was researching one in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where they have everything from rehabbed housing in existing neighborhoods to gold LEED certified infill mixed use development in downtown that has affordable housing incorporated into it along with market rates. So that really is a unique product, and it doesn't have to exclusively be residential. It could have mixed use as well.
Well, Trev, I know that you have to leave at quarter of, so I want to have time for our partners here to ask you questions. But before we do that, I have one question with you because you are sort of our retail guru. And you've seen from our outcomes that in terms of retail, we've been blowing that out of the water. And we've seen over the last 5 to 7 years, over 160 either new or expanded retailers, and not only downtown, but throughout the city. There's some concern about the pace of retail compared to the pace of office, to the pace of residential. And when we're looking at equity and we're looking at livable wages, what is that really doing for for the community? It's something that our steering committee, frankly, has been challenged by. The number one, should we be worried? You're shaking your head yes already? Okay, good. And two, what are you seeing in terms of trends and in other cities in this fashion? Retail usually follows. Here it seems to be leading.
Okay, so this is where the consultant gets to admit his mistakes in the original plan. I was following a 10% capture scenario for your primary trade area and a 5% capture scenario for your secondary trade area without getting into the weeds. That's been the standard I've been using. And basically what that does is when I define a trade area, I'm allowing for the forfeiture of the vast majority of the gap in retail sales. I just simply misfired on the gap. I think it should have been a 20 or 25% capture scenario. You're under retailed, you're getting now stabilized in retail and more happening. The other piece that factors into this is that my numbers are naturally conservative. We did a zip code survey of customers here in Lancaster, and when I do a gap analysis, I'm only looking at those who live within the defined geography. Remember, this is a community that attracts visitors from all over the world, and so that adds an additional layer of what I call icing on the cake or gravy on the taters to make your retail even more robust. Couple that with national trends that we're seeing as people do more online shopping for things like household appliances or electronic goods. They're craving the experiential retail that downtowns provide, and you all are doing that. You're not going to order a specialty pickle off of Amazon and have it shipped to your house, but you are going to go to the pickle shop here and pick out your custom pickle. And so that's food, but let's play that out for the t-shirts that you can get next to the market at, I get the name of the store wrong. Fox, yeah. You're not going to order that off of Amazon. You're going to say, I went to Lancaster and I bought that, or I live here and I bought that because it reflects who I am and the personality I am. And so the trend, I think, is going to be really important. With regard to the wage piece, at the end of the day, yes, those are jobs that may have a bit of a disconnect from what you would say is necessarily a living wage, but that these kind of independent businesses tend to not be as predatory to local residents because they're owned by local residents. So there's a tendency toward being more sensitive to the needs and more caring about the employees that they employ. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about it because I don't see that growth as being such a huge piece of your employment base to go, whoa, let's curtail retail because we're worried about that disconnect, when in fact you've got people here who probably really need that job, and it may be the first sort of step for them onto something more.
Why don't we, at least for a few minutes, open it up to the audience. We have a lot of partners here that are doing great work in communities surrounding downtown. And when we looked at the investment numbers, while downtown, because of the scale of the projects, see huge numbers, it's actually a great thing to be able to say that if you combine the commercial hubs, the investment that we're seeing in the commercial hubs, and the investment that we're seeing outside of downtown and outside of the commercial hubs, combined, that's actually more investment that we're seeing in the core downtown. And I think that's something that's lost on many people. But with that said, we still want to ensure that there's equitable investment throughout the city. And I only say that because we have so many people here that are, that are working to do that, and we do have some experts up here. So while we have them here, I'm going to offer the opportunity for any of you to ask questions.
And I'm happy to float around the room with the mic, so if you have a question, feel free to please raise your hand and I'll come to you. Start with Commissioner. Thank you.
I had a question regarding Tripp's comments on the land bank and tying it to your residential unit metric. So the county has a land bank, operates outside the city. I know the city has a land bank as well. I'm less familiar with it. The county's land bank is sort of picking up steam now. It's taking, especially in like Columbia is a good utilizer of it, taking blighted properties. Some of them have been off the market for like 40 years, boarded up, getting them back onto the market. And I think it's really pretty neat. My question is the city land bank doing similar things? I know that the city land bank is actually well capitalized. And then if so, is that going into your new residential unit count? Because I would argue that it should be. If you have blighted properties that have not been on the market many, many years, that should be going into your count because it's a good thing and it should be part of your metric.
Unfortunately, Randy Patterson couldn't be here, but someone raise their hand? Commissioner, no, you're right. The current numbers that you see like on our outcomes is mostly either rehabbed or new construction. We are tracking numbers now for projects like that LHOP, SACA are doing, which are long vacant properties, and we'll be adding that to the mix. As far as the city's land bank is concerned, I think they're sort of finalizing the bylaws and all of that. My understanding is the focus of that is just that. There's going to be a focus on residential, working with the LHOPs and the SACAs on turning around long vacant and underutilized properties in the neighborhoods. So I think I met with Matt a couple of weeks ago, Matt Sternberg, and the county's land development or land bank is actually doing some great things in Columbia. I think they're actually working with CAP.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jim.
We've got a lot of retail development that's just taking place outside of the city for Belmont, let's just bring that. Do you see that as being accretive, dilutive, and is there anything for the core city that could be done to make sure that it becomes accretive for the core?
As a retail market analyst, I see it as the benefits accruing to the city. When you have a Belmont and you're bringing in, P.F. Chang's or Neiman Marcus or whatever, Nordstrom Rack, stores like that. What you're doing is retaining a customer who might drive to King of Prussia or might drive to Towson to do that kind of once every couple months shopping. You're retaining that customer here. It's a whole lot easier to keep that customer staying in the overall Lancaster area, even though I view what's happening at Belmont as an Apple retail and what's happening in downtown as an Orange. They're two different kinds of retail, but if we're retaining a customer in the metro who might otherwise travel an hour or more to do that kind of purchase, that's a move in the right direction. And we are far past the stage where someone's going to say, oh, P.F. Chang's versus one of the independent Asian restaurants downtown, that's going to take away my business. That's not really happening. I'll go to P.F. Chang's too, but I still love my local Asian restaurants downtown. So it adds to that variety. It's a crew. The key point, I think, would be from a marketing standpoint, don't be defensive. Put it all together and say, hey, look at the complete package we as an overall area have. And sometimes that's challenging when they're different jurisdictions. But at the end of the day, the market gains. It's a win because you're retaining people who might otherwise travel.
So does it follow that we don't need to worry about Starbucks coming to town? That was a joke. You don't. Question on transportation. What have you seen in terms of any successful models around workforce transportation? Maybe a little bit more on that. We have some clusters of jobs that are anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes from downtown. And the question becomes, what do the solutions look like to marry that up? And do employers get involved in some way? Be interested in your thoughts on that.
I can start. Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I mean, we're saying that probably not so much for the 30 minutes away, but and you're doing it already with a lot of your investment in bike infrastructure, and we've seen in other communities too, provide alternate means. You know, a lot of the lower income population that doesn't have access to cars and jobs, and using creating multi-modes of getting there, and you know, increasing your bike infrastructure is going to be important. You know, we're working in Greenville, and you can elaborate in this way, one of the corridors leading into the city, and you know, the issue of the public bus transportation. I think it's what, hourly, that you know, they have just hourly service, and then trying to work with the local transportation authorities, or certainly in those areas targeting some corridors where there's more frequent service is going to be more critical. You might be able to elaborate on that.
And certainly, we are looking, I've seen in other communities, and we've explored employer-assisted, you know, sort of point-to-point transportation, or what I call sort of the last mile piece that gets them that last little connector to the stop or to the hub where it needs to be. I think that's where it becomes interesting to look at some of these shuttle systems in the core of the community that may get people to a transportation hub that could get them out into other parts of the community to the jobs. And that's a critical piece we see all over the country, because a fixed route system, you know, you're using heavy stock on that, and it's expensive to operate. So how do you look at a lighter stock system to do something? We're even seeing communities partner with rideshare, and that's still kind of squirrely, but it's happening in some places.
Rideshare like Uber?
Yes. Public-private partnership with Uber and Lyft. Particular voucher program, voucher programs, or just straight up negotiated partnerships.
So dealing with the one issue on the left-hand side of the matrix there, in terms of poverty levels and things like that, and trying to raise wages. So I guess the question I maybe directed to Marshall. So what's the coordination between LCA and Poverty Commission? What's going on there? And then number two, what advocacy going to transportation, for example, with the group that should be providing some of those services we're talking about, which is Red Rose or now South Central Transit Authority, who are not doing that as far as I'm concerned. And then number two is the lack of connection between the training agencies and getting people who are in the neighborhoods in the city to training programs in a more effective way.
I'm the moderator, not the panel member.
No.
You know, I'm actually going to put some other people on the spot, you know, in this room who are actually dealing with just those issues. I can say on the Poverty Commission, we have, well, actually, Jeremy, why don't you speak to that, because you're a member on one of the committees of the Poverty Commission. So that's how we're coalescing. And is
Where's Dan? There's Dan. So for a little context, the Mayor's Commission to Combat Poverty is now the Coalition to Combat Poverty. And they developed the One Good Job plan to help folks get out of poverty in our community. And it's hard to believe, but, and I won't speak too much to this, I'll let you speak to this, Dan, but they've already celebrated 1 year of implementation of that plan, and received some very high marks, which we should all be very proud of. We have been working very diligently to strengthen the connection between the Building on Strength Steering Committee, which is Lancaster City Alliance's economic development and planning executive leadership team, and the Poverty Coalition, which is helping to advance the implementation of the One Good Job Plan. There is a data analysis action team for the Poverty Coalition, which is keeping tabs on all those metrics associated with that One Good Job Plan. And I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity to join that team, so that should hopefully strengthen that relationship and that connection, especially as we look at numbers and how we're progressing. Dan, would you like to add a little bit to that? Sure. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, and I'll also add Marshall serves on the Lancaster Equity Community Development Corporation Board of Directors, along with Carlos and I and several other folks, where we've kind of created a macro community development organization where executive directors and also residents of impoverished communities are serving together to kind of think about ways to work as an accelerator for getting good things done, and to maybe take some bigger risks than separate nonprofits might be willing to take on their own. The other big news right now, and Tom and I are involved with the city, and this is being done through the private sector action team is where it started anyway. And I don't know if Lisa's still here as well, but working to have CoLab do a complete analysis of where we are with all the different workforce development entities that we have throughout the county, where the gaps are, and some suggestions for how we can get the machine working. As I described it at the first meeting, it feels like a machine where we have to first of all figure out where the gears aren't touching each other, and then ultimately which gears are missing, so that we can accelerate getting people who are, especially people in the short term who are underemployed and maybe trapped in dead-end jobs but have all the soft skills in the world, and getting them connected with the jobs that we know they can do if they had the connectivity and the support to move from one to the other. So we're working on that right now on several fronts, but we should have CoLab's final report on that within the next week or two, Thursday, so coming up very soon.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Great. And Jim, we're also looking at opportunities for, as we move forward with implementation of the plan, are there opportunities to work on workforce development opportunities there? For example, with the grants that we've received for facade improvement programs for the corridors, and so you guys are doing this too. Can we utilize our partners that are doing workforce training and construction to do that, to help close the gap in the construction openings, and also elevate our residents to a better wage. So and all of that is will be in conjunction with the Poverty Coalition, Lancaster Equity, all that. So together.
Some of the things that we're seeing, this is really not my area of expertise, but some of the things we're seeing in Baltimore is more focus on getting youth earlier on in programs of connecting, grade school, elementary, middle, and high school students, not just focusing at the higher education level, but getting them exposed to some opportunities and even time. One of the efforts that our office is involved in is working with there's a developer of some high-end housing that have some forest conservation, some requirements they have to do on their site. They can't do it because it's an urban site. Partnering with a local elementary school, incorporating their forest requirements on the school grounds, making that, doing a lot of green infrastructure, and then working with the schools program, exposing the kids to potential green jobs and opportunities in green jobs. And then now that's has leapfrogged over to another school in the community that has a middle and high school program. And so trying to get some continuity to kids from very early on to when they get to high school level, exposure to different jobs. And that's just one that's related to green jobs. There's others, other agencies in Baltimore that are dealing with connecting kids and middle school kids to health-related jobs or food and agricultural-related jobs.
Questions? I'll have one more for you. We talked about the plan's aspirations and how difficult it is to track that in many ways, as opposed to the outcomes, which are mostly bricks and sticks. Can you give any insight on ways that we might effectively track the progress of those aspirations?
I'll try on this one. It's very hard to have a metric to track aspirations. It's very interesting. There was a discussion I was listening to on the radio the other day about, are these things that define us, or are they things that we aspire to be? So, that metric is one that's always sort of a moving target. I think what I would encourage everyone to do, and it's very evident in this room by the nature of the answers to the questions and the people who are assembled here. Lancaster, Pennsylvania is exceptional in the country in that you have torn down silos that traditionally have kept different organizations from speaking with one another about difficult issues. It's evident in this room, it's evident through your progress, it's evident through the deliberate nature of implementing this plan and the Poverty Coalition undertaking that you're exceptional. Don't ever let that exceptionalism stand as a beacon for you as you look at tracking these, and consider any way possible to celebrate any victory, no matter how small it may seem, and consider that sometimes it's not a metric by which you're measuring. Sometimes it's a story, and telling the story of people and of business and of their dreams and aspirations and how they've come to be realized in Lancaster as a result of the collaboration you're doing is probably a really important thing as you look ahead in this plan.
Yes.
And something that all too often communities get so caught up in what are the numbers and what are the metrics that we forget the story. The story of this city is compelling. The story of this plan is compelling, and the story of your partnerships is compelling. So make sure you tell it. And if you tell it, those aspirations become standards by which everyone begins to measure. Are we honoring that story we heard? Are we honoring that person we engaged? I think that's the key takeaway. I know that sounds fuzzy and warm for a guy who likes crunching numbers on retail, but at the end of the day, I think that's an important consideration and one that you all are already doing.
Trevino, you have to.
With that, I'm leaving. Thank you all for having me. I know you have a few more minutes for you.
If there are no more questions, I think the last question I'd like to ask our two esteemed panel members are, we're 3 years into this plan, and in your past history of doing these types of plans and working with communities, how do we make sure that the plan, number one, stays fresh, we keep the community engaged, and we continue to move forward in the manner that we're
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think one of the things that we always recommend on one of these plans is to do. We recommend annual summits. Come back, do a report card, check on measure your successes, measure where you haven't maybe excelled where you wanted to, and then reset and focus. That's exactly what you're doing right here, and so I think whether the summit's every 3 years or 2 years or what have you, that's very important to keep, to continue to do. I think as Lancaster continues to attract new residents and businesses, expand your partners involved in helping making some of these recommendations, implementing the recommendations, and even some of the ones we talked about at lunch or throughout the day where you're making changes to the recommendations, involve your partners and new partners in the evolution of those new recommendations and what the changes are, so you're expanding the ownership in the plan. I think also how you're presenting the data and tracking the successes. We talked a little bit earlier about, maybe you break the poverty measurement out a little differently from some of the bricks and mortar projects. As Tripp was saying, with telling the story about the community, continue to tell the story about your success. John and Tripp and Marshall and I have presented at multiple planning conferences on the plan, and I think that gets the message out. Keep getting the message out to the broader audiences, but then also internally as you get new elected officials, new businesses that come in, arrange forums where you could give an overview of the plan and how they fit into the plan. I think having some ownership of the plan is going to be very important for keeping it alive and fresh. And so as much as you can connect individuals, whether it's a business or a resident, to the plan, is going to be important.
I'm just wondering what we're going to title the next plan 12 years from now. If we're building on strength and we're now strong, what is the next phase?
Forever strong. Andy?
The most impressive thing were these non-locals pronouncing Lancaster properly. Thanks everyone for attending and engaging in the great dialogue. All respective leadership teams will meet on their regularly scheduled dates to further discuss what we talked about today. And highlights from the meeting will be shared with all today's attendees. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.